case you're watching this on video, my name is Sofia Cervantes. The phone number is 818-543-4636. And my email is Sofia with an F as in Frank, SOFIA .Cervantes, CERVANTES at SCDD.ca.gov. All right, so feel free to reach out to us as needed in the future. All right, so this is our part 2. Okay, so I will go briefly. Last week, we talked about the fact that IEP meetings are really reserved for the purposes of requesting a new service and requesting a change in service. So that's really the 2 reasons why you would be requesting an IEP meeting. Now, if you have an IEP that has the services that you think your son or daughter needs, that looks good, but the school is not implementing the IEP, if they're violating the IEP by not implementing it, meaning not providing the services that are on it, or 2, they are breaking the law. For example, maybe you requested a meeting and it's been more than 30 days and they haven't provided that meeting, then they are breaking the law or breaking your right. For example, you have the right to record your IEP meetings as long as you give them 24-hour notice. If any of those things are violated, then you can do what's called a state compliance complaint. Okay, so if you already have a good IEP, but it's not being implemented, an IEP meeting is really not necessary. It's more taking the route of doing a complaint. For any disagreements with the district, it would be a due process. For anything related to discrimination within the school setting, it would be a complaint to the Office of Civil Rights. And I'm going through this quickly, being that we did this last week. We briefly talked about letters of understanding, and we talked about the importance of documenting things, right? If things are not in writing, it's kind of like they never happened. So ensuring that you have documentation of conversations that took place, of anything that you think needs to be recorded, and adding this magic phrase at the end: if anything in this letter is incorrect, please notify me or inform me within a reasonable amount of time. And making sure that you have this letter and you have a copy or you have a receipt that they indeed have received your letter. That's very important. We talked about assuming that at some point you may have some disagreements with the school and you may need to go to a due process. We discussed that it may be beneficial for you to assume that you will go to a due process so that you're ready for it. Many times, if we don't plan for that, then when you want to go to a due process, you find yourself without really much evidence to support your case and to help the lawyer that would be supporting you. Okay, we then briefly went over some things such as you have the right to record your IEP meetings as long as you give 24-hour notice, and we expressed and we recommend do it in writing. Anything that you're requesting, anything in writing. We talked about the fact that you don't have to sign your IEP document on that day. It must be done, it must be signed, but within a reasonable amount of time is what the law identifies. We also talked about the fact that you don't have to necessarily sign. You must sign it within a reasonable amount of time, but you may sign it in agreement or disagreement or partial agreement. You may agree with one portion of your IEP while you may be in disagreement with another portion of your IEP. And so you may sign your document accordingly. We also discussed the importance of parents writing and submitting a parent report. A document that includes your words, your language, and identifying the needs of your son under different categories, right? So communication, bullet points of what the issues are. Communication, social skills, bullet points of what the issues are. Behavior, etc. So choosing categories, putting bullet points, putting notes in your own words of what the issues are under these categories, that can be a parent report. And the law says that the IEP team must consider it. They may not be in agreement with it, but they must consider it. We talked about the fact that services are obtained through a deficit-driven process, that we must identify what is the need in order to later talk about what the service is. In that conversation, we discussed the importance of using the word appropriate and not best. Not saying, if my son has a one-on-one, that would be the best for him. Eliminating that word from our vocabulary in IEP meetings. Why? Because the law talks about your son and daughter has the right to a free, appropriate public education, not a free, best public education. So staying in line with the language that the law uses, so saying 30 minutes of communication is appropriate for my son based on his or her needs, right? Or saying my son having a one-on-one, my daughter having a one-on-one is appropriate, not best. We discussed the fact that it's important, sometimes in the IEP meetings, we come into the IEP meeting, right? And we start requesting services without recognizing that it really is a pyramid structure. We must first lay the foundation of what are the needs of my son or daughter. Then we must work together to establish goals on the IEP. And then would come the services. So we talked about the fact that the parent report can really support you in establishing this need that's at the bottom of that pyramid. And then together with the team, establishing the goals and then requesting services. And really, if we've done a good job in these first two levels, then services should kind of more easily flow. Not saying it's an easy process, because probably most of you would say, oh, IEPs are hard and I struggle going to them and I'm nervous. And so we're not saying it's easy, but when you focus on these first two levels, then services should hopefully flow more naturally, and the school can clearly see why certain services are important, necessary, and appropriate for your son or daughter. All right. So if I'm not mistaken, this is where we left off. Okay, so we left off on the structure of the IEP. Okay, so the structure of the IEP is usually evaluations are held. Okay, and this is why next week we will talk a little bit more about the importance of evaluations. Why are evaluations so important? Because it's usually what the conversation is based on. Okay, so usually evaluations will be conducted. We'll talk about more details about that in just a little bit. Those evaluations will then give us what are called PLOPs, present levels of performance, meaning where is your son or daughter, how are they demonstrating their ability? What level are they demonstrating their ability, okay, and their skills? Knowing those levels of performance, where they test, where they are performing, will help the team develop appropriate goals and objectives, okay? From things that you found out in the evaluation, it should also help you determine what accommodations are needed, what modifications are needed. And we'll talk about the differences in just a little bit. But accommodations and modifications are both part of what is included in the IEP. Then we see that services are discussed and identified on the IEP. And then lastly, placement. And placement means the setting in which your son or daughter will learn, right? Will they be in a mainstream class with a one-on-one? Will they be placed in a special day class or in an autism focused class? Will 80% of their time in school be in a mainstream class and 20% in a special day class, or etc., right? So placement refers to where will they learn? What setting will they learn? Then the accommodations are so that you know what accommodations need to be provided within that setting, what modifications need to be made within that setting. And then services are usually given in addition, right, to the placement. In recent months, I've received a few questions about this. So just in case it's helpful to clarify, keep in mind, placements and services are different, right? Services and supports are not necessarily part of the package of the placement. What I mean by that is he or she may be, the student may be in a special day class. It doesn't mean that that placement comes with occupational therapy or speech and language or a one-on-one. Those are things in addition, separately, and those things can be discussed on the IEP. Okay, so sort of you could think of the fact that each one of these should lead to the next. The evaluation leads you to the present levels of performance. The present levels of performance lead you to develop the goals and objectives. The evaluations inform what accommodations and modifications are needed. The evaluations, present levels of performance, goals and objectives determine what services are needed. And then all of this put together usually gives us an idea what will be the best setting for my son or daughter to learn in. Okay, so as you can see, because evaluations are at the top, it's so important for us to know what is it that we're looking at, right? One, knowing how to request and how often can you request these evaluations, but then requesting the report and making sure that I know what I'm looking at, right? You might have had access to a report in the past, an evaluation report, and yet you read it and you're like, I am not sure what it means. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to understand by this report. Okay, so again, evaluation is super important, which is why we will focus on them a little bit later at the end of this presentation and next week. All right. So the reason and I'll switch back and forth a little bit, the reason we provide this pyramid and sort of give you this visual anchor is because what we find is that sometimes families approach the IEP process a little bit backward, right? So you may be in a meeting, an IEP meeting, and you may say, well, you know, they kind of talked at the beginning, the team, the people from the school, they talked and, you know, I was there, but I really only participated at the end when they talked about what services my son or daughter needed. And again, as you remember from the pyramid, that's usually not effective if we wait till the end to participate, because what that means is we haven't really laid the foundation for what are my son's and my daughter's needs, right? Services are a reflection of the level of need that my son or daughter has. So if I don't really participate in establishing the need, identifying what the needs are, then I'm probably going to struggle a little bit more in requesting services and in the school district agreeing or knowing why that service is being requested. Right. So sometimes we sit there throughout these conversations that are happening at the beginning, and yet we leave kind of wondering what happened in the IEP, right? What did we even walk out with? So it's important for families to understand the evaluations, okay? And to be able to participate in establishing our needs. As you participate in these meetings, it's important, and I hope that some of this presentation empowers you to really recognize that you are an important member of this IEP team. I know some families give us a call, and again, as advocates, we tend to receive a lot of the phone calls from parents who are having conflict with their school district, right? So a lot of the times we may hear some parents say, well, I was told I had to be in that meeting. I was given 24-hour notice and I had to cancel my doctor appointment because they told me if I wasn't there, things were gonna, services were gonna go away. And I feel like it's their meeting, not mine. And so to that, we say it is important for you to feel in charge in that meeting too, because you indeed are an equal participant as the rest of the team. If you don't feel that way in the meetings, then we encourage you, what might you be able to do, including writing a parent report, to feel that you kind of have a sense of what you want to talk about during this meeting. It's not just the school's opportunity to ask you questions and talk, but it is your opportunity to present information and to also ask questions, okay? So again, one of the ways that we say it's so important is to be able to complete a parent report so that you can establish that need. And the law says that the IEP must consider, right, the parent report. They must consider it. It could be part of the IEP. It doesn't mean they'll agree necessarily with everything that you think is a need or is necessary, but it must be considered. So if here you have evaluators who are writing, 50 pages on your son or daughter when they just saw him or her for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, right? Then how much more would you have to say about your son or daughter? Who else knows your daughter, your son better than yourself, right? You know exactly what their gestures mean, why they do certain things. So all that is important to be expressed to the team. And what better way than to write a parent report, okay? So because the evaluations are at the top of the IEP structure, it's important to, again, understand evaluations. We will talk about this a little bit more during the end of this presentation and toward next week as we finalize our special education series. But it's important for you to know that it's important for you to know what the document, what the report says, okay? It's important for us to know that the school is required to do evaluations. Does anyone know how often should schools be conducting evaluations? Feel free to use the chat. How often do they have to do evaluations? Thank you for that. Someone said no idea. Okay, perfect. That's why we're here, right? So feel free to put in your answers. I'll see if any come in. But the school must, by law, must conduct evaluations every 3 years. Every 3 years, the school must do an evaluation, okay? This is why sometimes your IEPs, you might hear that they call them triennials, because every 3 years, that IEP meeting usually includes evaluations. So they call it a triennial, right? It's pretty much an IEP, but because they conducted evaluations, they call it the triennial. However, so schools are required, the law says they must, they shall, usually the law says shall or may. When you see the word shall, it means they have to. So they shall conduct evaluations every 3 years in areas of disability and in areas of suspected disability. Okay, we'll get into that in just a little bit. However, so schools required every 3 years. However, you have the right to request evaluations every year, if so you wish. Excuse me. You may not want to request it every year, but you have the right to. Now, is the school going to approach you? Is the school going to tell you, hey, it's been a year, do you want to do an evaluation? Very likely the answer is no, right? They're going to approach you and maybe even chase you a little bit every 3 years because they have to do these evaluations, but you have the right to request it every year. And again, you can request it in the areas of disability, somewhere where we already know your son or daughter struggles, or in the areas of suspected disability. So let's say that your son or daughter has never really had challenges with their social emotional functioning, okay? But after COVID, you notice a lot more anxiety, some depression. Sometimes they can't get out of bed to come to school. If those conditions are affecting their academic functioning and progress, then they may be new areas, those may be new areas of suspected disability. A disability or a condition that is hindering their ability to make academic progress. Okay, so every year you have the choice of saying, I'm going to request an evaluation, or you know what, I think we're okay. Some families might say, absolutely, let's have one every year, because if we don't, how do we know where they are currently? Right? How do we know if they need more services than last year, or maybe less of this and more of this, right? How do you get a good framework of what they need if we don't have evaluations? Now, some families may say, in a year, maybe I'll request it every 2 years, because in a year, not much changes for my son or daughter. So I'm okay with doing it every 2. Some might say, I'm okay with just every 3. But know that you have the right to request it. There's a question, if we request it every year, can the school say no? Great question. The answer is no. They must conduct the evaluation if you request it. Now, because of this, because of how important it must be for you to request an evaluation, what we do say is make sure that you do it in writing. Okay, so if you're going to request an evaluation, make sure that it's in writing, sort of like when we talked last week about the letters of understanding. Make sure that it's in writing, and make sure that you have a receipt that they received your request. The reason we say this is because there are legal timeframes by which the school has to respond to you. If they do not respond to you, then you have the option of doing what we talked about last week, a state compliance complaint. If you request an evaluation and they say no, they are violating your right. Therefore, you have the right to file a state compliance complaint. However, if you don't have proof when you requested it and the fact that they received it, then it's almost like the clock, you don't really have proof that the clock started running, right? So if the law says they must do this by X amount of days, right, and you don't have proof when you sent it, then I'm not saying you can't make a complaint, but your request is a little less strong than if you had evidence. Hey, I requested it on this date. Here's the proof that they received it. It's now been 20 days and I've heard nothing, right? So it's important for us to do it in writing, but to answer your question again, no, they may not say no. Now, can they? In terms of will they? Maybe. I'm not, when parents ask me, can the school do this? And our response is usually the school can do whatever they like, in a sense. Now, is it legal? That's for you to sort of increasing your awareness so that you say, hey, that's not legal. I get to do a state compliance complaint. When we look at the law, it's important to consider that the law is kind of like our traffic symbols in the street, right? So in the street, we see stop signs, which we must stop according to traffic law, right? We must stop when the light is red. We must slow down when it's yellow. We must go forth when it's green. However, what happened? Does everyone make a stop? I mean, all of us, of course, I'm sure, are perfect drivers. But has no one ever passed a red light? Has no one ever not made a stop sign or a stop at a stop sign? But if no one sees it, then what happens? The law is there. They must do this. But if no one sees it, kind of no foul, right? So kind of the same thing with any law. There is special education law, the law IDEA, there's FAPE. You have rights. And if the school violates them and you kind of don't say anything about that violation, then it's kind of like someone who passed a stop and no one saw it and no one did anything. But when you know that they violated a right or some sort of legal time frame or whatever it may be, you have the right to make a state compliance complaint to say, hey, they passed a red light. Because what occurs is sometimes, based on what we hear of families, is sometimes if the school says no on something, for example, the person who asked the question, I requested an evaluation and they told me, oh, we're not doing them right now because we're still backed up from COVID. So we can't do it right now. If I am okay with that answer and I back off and never come back, the school's going to maybe be okay with that, right? But you're in this training now, you're learning that no, they may not tell you no. So you may proceed to answering when they say, oh no, we're not doing it right now. One, you may say, well, can I see your policy, or you're saying that's a rule for the school? Can I see that in writing? I'd love to learn more, right, about this policy. Now, you know that it's not accurate with the law that they are not conducting evaluations. They must conduct evaluations. So you can immediately then write your letter of understanding, say, hey, in such and such date, I saw you in the hall or whatever it may be. I requested an eval. You told me that evaluations were not being conducted right now. I asked you for the policy. It's been 10 days and I have not received anything. If anything in this letter is incorrect, please notify me within a reasonable amount of time. You can submit that, and if you want to, proceed to do a state compliance complaint. Okay, so to answer that question, you may ask for evaluations every year. The school must do them, and to ensure that you have all your ducks lined up per se, then it is in your best interest. We highly encourage that you always do it in writing, all your requests with the date on top and with that magical phrase, of if anything in this letter is incorrect, please notify me within a reasonable amount of time, and then having proof that they received it, okay? So it'll be important it's important to know that. Again, school is required to do evaluations every 3 years. You have the right to request an evaluation every year. Okay. All right. I see that my own hand is raised. I am not sure how I did that, but that's funny, right? I have a question in my own presentation. All right. If one of the hosts is able to bring it down, feel free. If not, that's quite okay. Oh, thank you. Went away. All right. So again, if you're going to request something like this, right? If you're going to request an evaluation or an IEP meeting or whatever else, again, make sure that you use that magic phrase and that you have evidence that it was received. Okay. All right. So now we're going to get into some good stuff, some sort of technical things. Okay. So what we're seeing here, we are going to enter more in depth this topic of evaluations. And again, because it's so important for us to understand what is an evaluation saying about my son or daughter, and how will knowing this before the meeting help me prepare for the meeting. So from the evaluation report, you could already gather what they're going to tell you in the meeting, whether they're going to say yes services, no services, whatever that may be. So it's super important for us to know what are we looking at. Now, first thing to note is, it is my understanding you will not get a pretty image like this, although this looks confusing right now, maybe to some of us. But you won't get an image like this in the evaluation report, not to my understanding. What I want you to know is in your Google Drive, you do have blank sheets like the one that you see on your screen, so that you can use these to sort of graph numbers that you see on your report. So let me backtrack and explain. So when reports are conducted, and when evaluations are conducted, and depending on what type of evaluation it is, reports or scores will be reported in either standard scores, which we see here, or sub-test scores, or T-scores or C-scores, or, pardon me, I missed the first one, percentages, okay? It's my understanding that mostly you will see them reported in standard scores, okay? So here we see percentages, we see standard scores, sub-test, T-scores, and Z-scores. You'll notice, if you follow me here, if you look at the 2%, this graph tells us that 2% is the equivalent to a 70, a number 70 in standard scores, which is also equivalent to a 4 in subtest scores. So a 2% equals a 70 standard score equals a 4 subtest score equals a 30 T-score and equals a -2 Z score. What we're looking at here is kind of like if I told you, hey, can I borrow $1? Or do you have 4 quarters? Or can I have 10 dimes or 20 nickels or 100 pennies, right? 100 pennies is equivalent to $1. The same as 100 pennies is equivalent to 4 quarters, 25 cents. 100 pennies is equivalent to 10 dimes. Does that make sense? So these scores are reported differently, but they equal the same thing. And this graph lets you know what equals what. Okay, now, so again, so a 50% is 100 in a standard score. Now, as you can imagine, it matters for you to know, are we talking percentages or standard scores? Because if you tell me, oh, they scored a 70%, you'll see a 70% is right here. I believe you could see my cursor moving. A 70% is right here versus a 70 in standard score is way over here, right? So it matters. So when you see an evaluation report, one of the first questions you want to ask yourself is, how are the scores being reported? Are they in percentage or percentile? Are they in standard score or subtest score or T or Z score? Okay. Now, let's for a second walk away from special education. Okay. What we know is that this bell curve, we call this image a bell curve, and it's used in statistics to describe different things. Okay. So again, let's step away from special education for a second. What this bell curve tells us, and I'm going to flip just for a little bit to the Spanish side so that Spanish speakers can see that. So what this image tells us is that the majority of whatever you are talking about lies here in the middle. So let's explore an example. Follow me on this example. And feel free to use the chat or open up your mic if you're comfortable. So this bell curve describes the height, the stature, the height of women. What do you say is the average height for women? What do you think is kind of the average height for women? Anyone, any thoughts? Five, 4. I see a 5'4". Okay. I see a 5'5". Okay. So how about we say on average, women are from 5.3, let's say 5'3", not 5.3, but 5'3" to 5'7". Would we agree? On average, the majority of women are within 5'3" and 5'7". So 5'3" would be right here where our 16% is, if you see this, and 5'7" would be right here where our 84% is. And what this is saying is the majority of women, the thickest, the widest part of this bell curve indicates that the majority of us, the majority of women are 5'3" to 5'7". We agree on that. What this bell curve is also telling us is there are women that are above that average of 5'7". So we might say above average for a woman would be 5'8" to maybe 6'2". Would you agree? 6'2" is pretty tall. So maybe these are your women that are athletes, right? Your volleyball players, your basketball players. So on average, a woman measures between 5'3" and 5'7", but there are some women, not as many, The graph is showing us not as many. The curve starts tapering down, but there are some women that their height is between 5'7" and 6'2". Now, the graph is telling us that there's women that are even taller than 6'2". If you see, the bell curve is getting really small. It's thinning out. Why? Because the majority of women do not lie in this category. But indeed, there are women who are in the superior category of height. So there are women that are 6'4" and above. These might be your phenomenon women, right? They might have even the gigantic condition, right? Where they are extremely tall. These are the people that you may see in the Guinness Book of Records in some sort of circus thing, right? They are super, super tall, okay? Now, what does the graph tell us on the other side? That there are women, don't tell my mom I'm using her as an example. My mom is pretty short, love her, she's cute. So she's shorter than we said 5'4", 5'3" was our average, right? So there's women that are from 5'2" to 4'9", right? They're a little shorter than the average. And then what this bell curve tells us is there are women who are even shorter, right? So 5'3", or sorry, we were going to 5'3" to, let's say, 4'9", and then there's women that are below 4'8", okay? So they start getting, it tapers off because there isn't many. So these women on this 1% here under the deficient category in this graph, they might be women who have the condition of dwarfism, right? So again, not many women, but some women, okay? So again, this graph is telling us the average of women, the majority are this tall, but there are some that are taller and there are some that are super taller. On the other side, there are some that are shorter. There are some that are much shorter. I hope that concept makes sense, right? Now, bringing it back to special education. Every time that your son or daughter is evaluated, the goal is to identify where does your son or daughter lie in this bell curve. Okay, when you are looking at numbers that are reported in your evaluation report, you are looking to see where is this evaluation saying that my son or daughter lies in this bell curve. As I mentioned, the school may not give you this bell curve, but you, when you get your evaluation report, you may look and say, okay, they're reporting in percentages, and they said my son is at a 63 for whatever evaluation they're doing in percentage. So you can look here and say, okay, this is where they're saying my son or daughter is. Okay, so the goal of the evaluation is to determine, is your son or daughter within the average in this category that they're being evaluated for? Are they, let me go back to the English, are they above average? Or are they in the superior category? Or on the other side, are they below average? And or are they testing in the deficient category? Okay, so the goal is to identify where are they. Now, if in the evaluation report, again, you notice that they're reporting in percentages and you see that they're saying that they tested at a 63%. You already know that they are saying that your son or daughter is within the average result. Now, a question for you to answer on the chat, or feel free to open up your mic. If your son or daughter is identified to be within the average, do you expect that they will offer services during that IEP meeting? Yes or no? Right away, someone replied no. Anyone else? Correct. I see another no. Correct. No. Why? Because they're within the average. They're testing like the majority of people. Okay. Now, so anything average won't get services. So obviously, if they test above or superior, you can expect they're going to say 0 services, right? Now, if they test below average, what would you say that they might get? Do you think that you will get services if they test below average? Someone said basic minimum. Okay, someone replied no. If they tested below average, do you think they will be recommending services during your IEP meeting? No. Okay. The answer in this is actually some services, because your son or daughter tested below average. So they at least should be recommending some services. Someone else said maybe, right? Some services. If they test in the deficiency category, will they be getting services? They should be getting more services. Okay, so I have this here. So if we look at this graph, if you test anything between average and above, you can expect no services. If you see that they tested below average, you should be expecting that they should be recommending some services. Someone said the minimum, yeah, maybe the minimum here for below average, very basic services. If they're deficient, you might see that they're offering more services or recommending, more services. Now, there are times where it is identified, or the evaluation is identifying, that your son is below the average. But the evaluation report, the same evaluation report that says your son is indeed below average, when you flip to the recommendations part toward the end of the evaluation report, that same report says what services are recommended? 0. You may find that the document says your son is indeed below average, but we are recommending 0 services. If that occurs, we refer to that as the document or the evaluation is internally inconsistent. And I just typed it on the chat. Internally inconsistent, meaning in the same document, you're telling me that my son is below average, and in the same, a few pages later, you're saying he needs no services. Does that make sense? It doesn't. It doesn't make sense. Because if he's below average, what is it that's going to push him into the average category if there's no intervention? So that itself can be your argument. If you read your evaluation report before the meeting and you already know they should be offering me at least some services because my son is below average, and you look at the document and it says, man, the document says that they're not recommending services, you know that you can already go ready to make that argument. Hey, explain to me, how does it make sense that you reported below average and are recommending 0 services? You may also find, right, that they tested in the deficiency category and they're only recommending minimal services. You can also argue, hey, doesn't make sense that you're offering the bare minimum when my son is not just below average, but deficient. What's important to note is, look at your graph, the image here. The standard scores stop at 70 here, okay? But you see that they're going in intervals of 5, right? So 85, 80, 75, 70, 65, 60. Let's say your son or daughter tests on standard scores of 40. How on the deficient category is he or she? Very. It's different when someone says, oh, they tested deficient. but how deficient? At 65, right here, where I have my cursor, or at 30, right? Do the drawing, extend the screen for yourself, right? 65, 60, 55, 50, 45, 40, 35, 30, right? So look at how far in the deficient category is your son if he is testing a 30 in standard score. That's important for you to know before the meeting, because if they tell you, we're recommending 5 minutes of services a week, you might say, whoa, that's the bare minimum, and my son is way on the deficiency category. It doesn't make sense to me. How are we going to get him to travel all the way to the average category with 5 minutes a week? Does that make sense? It is not appropriate for my son to only receive 5 minutes. Okay. Someone says, can you send a simple link to the original bell curve? If you needed anything aside from what's on the Google Drive, in the Google Drive, you do have these, but if you want something in addition, please feel free to email me. And if the team wouldn't mind putting my info on the chat again, I would greatly appreciate it. And again, you do have these graphs on the Google Drive, okay, for you to use and print and use as you wish, okay? So again, so important, right? Now that we're learning this, so important for me to know where are they going to say my son or daughter is. Now, I hope I haven't lost your attention with all this. The next thing, highly important, by you knowing where they are saying that your son or daughter falls, in what category, average, below, or deficient, you also get to know, right? What happens if the report says your son, the number is 110 in standard score? Where's 110? Right here. And let's say it's some sort of speech or some sort of communication evaluation. Okay. When you look at this evaluation, if you say, that makes sense for my son or daughter, they're kind of a little even getting closer to above average in their communication, this evaluation makes sense. I agree. But let's say the report says that, again, they're at 110 or 75%. And you look at the evaluation and say, who exactly are we talking about? Because this is not my kid. This is not that. I don't know how you got this number, but it's not my kid. If that's the case, and you know that before the meeting, what you should also know is in this meeting, you get to say, I disagree with this evaluation. I am requesting what is called an independent evaluation, which is pretty much a second opinion by someone who is not connected to the district. Paid by the district pays for this independent evaluation, but it is conducted by someone who is outside of the school system, okay, or the school district. So what's important, so question number one, when you get an evaluation report, would be what scores, right? What scores are being used to report these numbers, number one. Number two, do I agree? Okay. And if I do agree, then my next question is, do I also agree with the services being recommended? If my answer is no, I don't agree with even the number that is being given to my son or daughter, then you get to disagree and request an independent evaluation. Okay. If you agree with where they said the number lies for your son or daughter, but you disagree with their recommendation, you also get to say, I disagree with this evaluation. I am requesting an independent evaluation. Okay, I see a question that says, how do we go about requesting an independent evaluation that the school will pay for? And do all the categories have the same scoring table. Let me address that first one. So how do we go about requesting an IEE? Let me switch screens now. You have the right to a second opinion. So one, you in the meeting must say you disagree with the school's evaluation, and right there in the meeting, you may request the independent evaluation. After the meeting, it would probably suit you best to, in writing, say, dear such and such, to the IEP team, we had our meeting today. I am in disagreement with the school's evaluation. I am requesting an independent evaluation. If anything in this letter is incorrect, please notify me within a reasonable amount of time. And that is your request, okay? Now, keep in mind that the school has, or before I go there, well, let me go there, so many thoughts. So keep in mind that the school may give you a list of who you could go to for these independent evaluations, and that's okay. Keep in mind too, you could choose from the list, or if you have someone else that you had in mind for doing this independent evaluation, you may do that, okay? But keep in mind that they may give you a list. It doesn't mean that they are contracted with the school, but the school has a list as a courtesy to give to parents, is my understanding. You don't have to choose from that list, but you would, if you have someone else, you can suggest that, but they will give you a list. Now, before going to that second question that was there, do know, it's very important to know, when you request an independent evaluation, the school only has two options. They may either say, okay, yes, we will pay for that independent evaluation, or they must take you to due process to defend their evaluation. The school only has two options. Either you pay it or you take me to due process, okay? They may not just say no. If they say no, right, it doesn't mean that now you have to request a due process. No, right? So you request an independent evaluation, they either grant your request or they initiate the due process. The reason why I'm trying to highlight this and why it's important is there is a term called the burden of proof. And the burden of proof is the person who has the burden of proving whatever is being discussed, right? It is more burdening in terms of evidence. The person who initiates the due process has more burden to provide evidence than the person who is being called to a due process. So the reason why this is important is if the school district only has the choice of saying, yes, we will pay for it, or no, we will take you to due process, beware, because if they're saying no to the IEE, then they must be going to a due process. And don't let yourself be tricked into you requesting the due process, because then that means you would put on yourself the burden of proof when really it should be the school. Okay, so again, they really only have two options. Either they say yes or they take you to due process. Okay, so if there is something there in the middle, if they're not deciding in the middle, you can do a state compliance complaint. They are violating the law. Okay, because again, when you request it, they must do only one of those two. Do all the categories have the same scoring table? If I'm understanding correctly, by categories, I believe you mean, do all the types of evaluations have the same scoring table? Yeah, it's my understanding that all evaluations will be reported in one of those scores: percentage, standard score, subtest, or Z-score, or T-score. Okay, and so you should, maybe that'll be your homework. For you to go and look for an old, maybe evaluation report that you received. Okay, now it's important to know, I keep saying that, right? But it's important to know everything that we're discussing. But it's important let me look at one question here. If I go to due process, should I now get a lawyer? Yes, yes. So due process, definitely we encourage you would need a lawyer, and we encourage get a lawyer of special education. That be their specialty. Let's say you yourself are a lawyer or your partner is a lawyer, but they're not a special education attorney, then we would say you still need a lawyer that practices special education law. Okay, the special education law is so intricate that you really want a lawyer who knows all the ins and outs. Now, along with that question, when we hear about due process and when we hear, oh man, you're going to need a lawyer, we understand that it could be a little bit, right, a little bit intimidating, or oh man, I don't have the money for that. It's crucial for you to know that because of FAPE, the law that says that your son, daughter is entitled to a free, appropriate public education, because of FAPE, if you win your due process, then the school must reimburse you for the attorney fees. Okay, so because of that, if a lawyer looks at your case and says, oh, we're going to win this, there are some lawyers who might be willing to take your case for a very low retainer fee, or zero at the beginning, because they're confident and know that you will be reimbursed and their check will come, right? Because the school will have to reimburse. Note that they only would reimburse an attorney, okay, not an advocate. There are special education advocates, and that would not be reimbursable. Now, if the advocate is working under the attorney, right, but the attorney is the one claiming the fees, then sure, the attorney would get the money, and then sure, they can pay the advocate that's been working. But keep that in mind, right? So only attorney fees would be reimbursed, okay? So with this, again, a quick recap, you want to be able to understand what's happening in the evaluation report prior to the evaluation report, so that you can determine, am I even in agreement with what's on this document? Am I in agreement with the score? And am I in agreement with the recommendation for services? If my answer is no to either of those, you get to request an independent evaluation, and the school can only either say yes to funding that evaluation or to take you to due process. Now, do know that the law doesn't say that they have to give you the evaluation report before the IEP meeting. Okay, there is no current law that says that they must give you that ahead of time. However, one, you may request it. How do we request it? In writing. The answer will always be in writing, in writing, in writing. Okay, so you would request. And again, the law doesn't say, and I say this because it's important for you to know what is your right and then what is the law not clear on, so that we don't go in there and say that you have to, right? Because they don't. However, the rationale that one might use is the law does say that you are an equal participant of the IEP team. So if the team received the report ahead of time and is able to discuss the report in the meeting because they had access to it before, why should you not, being that you are an equal participant in that room? Okay, so one, you can request it. You can request to have it 3 days before the meeting. 5 days, 3 to 5 might be reasonable. Okay, and again, they don't have to provide it. So what happens if they don't? Okay, some things to keep in mind for you as choices, and again, this is very up to you and how you want to manage your interactions with the school and with the team. But one option would be when the meeting starts and they say, oh, here's the evaluation report, and you remind them, you know, I requested this beforehand so that I could have reviewed it and participate as you guys can, because you read the report before this meeting. One, you might consider saying, I'm going to need a 30-minute break before we start to be able to review this report. And or, given that I am just receiving the report, I'm going to ask to reschedule this meeting so that I can have time to review it the way that the rest of the team has been able to review it. And then we can all be on the same page and continue our meeting. Those are some options for you to consider. Now, might the team be thrilled about those options? Probably not, right? One, because it would require rescheduling, or it would start with a 30-minute break, right? Usually they kind of want to move along. That being said, if you can't participate effectively and equally with them because of the lack of information, that's your call then. What might feel best for you to do given that circumstance? Okay, so just some options and thoughts for you to have about the evaluation. But again, as you see, it's so important for you to be able to go into the meeting knowing where do they say my son is and do I agree? Okay, so that you know where it's going to go. All right. Before we continue, okay, and we'll go into some of these strategies next week because they're a little bit more specific to evaluations, and that'll be our specific topic next week. But before we go on, and we're at 7:13, so I'd like to end maybe at about 7:45 to be able to take some questions. But for the moment, before we move on to other things, are there any questions? Feel free to write on the chat or raise your virtual or real hand. Okay, no questions. I know we've answered some throughout, so that's good. Okay, perfect. We'll move on. So next is, remember, evaluations allow you to be aware of the present levels of performance. Okay, PLOPs, present levels of performance, describe what your child can do. Okay, and those PLOPs should be based on what the evaluations tell you. Okay, these PLOPs should identify what they could do. Okay, so kind of not completely different, but kind of moving on from that graph that we saw, because that graph kind of tells us where they are. The PLOPs specifically tell you what can they do. It's present levels of performance, right? What are they able to do? So these PLOPs should identify their strengths and their needs. Okay, because if you learn about what they could, how they're performing, you also obviously also learn about what they cannot do. So they should describe functional, developmental, and academic performance. Okay, so functional and developmental, are they performing according to their age, according to the levels that they should be performing at based on their age? I want to point you quickly, just so that you know, let me look for it here. 1 second. I just want to point you to the fact that in your Google Drive, you do have a booklet called Developmental Milestones, is what it's called. And I'll flash it on the screen in just a little bit. Everyone sees the Google Drive? Oops, I think that might be the wrong one. Awesome, thank you. So if you go here to your Google Drive and you go to English and you go to IEP Part 1 and 2, you will see this third document is called Developmental Milestones. This is only for ages 0 to 5, okay? The reason we give this, regardless of your child's age, is if you find something, so this goes through physical development, intellectual, language, social emotional development for all the different ages, from ages 0 to 5, okay? So if here under the age of 3, let's say, or wherever you're looking, right? You find a skill that they are not yet performing and they even exceed the age of 5, then you know that there is a big gap between where they should be and where they are actually performing. Okay, so even though it says 0 to 5, if your son or daughter is older than that, you may still want to look at this to explore, wow, is my son or daughter really performing even way below their age? Maybe they're 9, maybe they're 8, right? And this was a skill that was supposed to be accomplished by the age of 4. You can now see how behind they are, okay? So the present levels of performance identify those strengths that they have, and they identify those needs that they have. Okay, so present levels of performance then help us establish goals. Okay, goals, remember, are that second thing. So you can say that plops are kind of, they establish the need. Remember that pyramid we looked at? The plops establish the need. The goals are what are going to go on your IEP, and then those are the ones that can give you access to services, because goals means that they're not doing this, right? They need intervention. They need services to be able to actually meet those goals. So goals should be something you want your child to achieve 1 year from the IEP. This is where we start thinking. We want to make sure that goals are not too high, that they will not meet them by the end of the year, and that they're not too low, that they're not so low that they're actually meeting them within 3 months, and then they're kind of doing not challenging themselves for this rest of the school year because, oh, look at that, they already met their goal, right? So it's just finding that sweet balance between too high of a goal and too low of a goal. Goals should be based on the needs identified in the plops. Okay, so these plops are going to indicate sort of what the goals should be. If there is no goal, there is no need. And that's important. Because if later in the meeting you ask for a service, but there's no goal for it, we can already anticipate what is the school probably going to say? Nope, they don't need it. Because if we don't have a goal, that means they didn't have a need in that area. So another piece of assignment for your homework this week is looking at your IEP and really asking yourself, is there a goal for every area of need that my son or daughter has? And if the answer is no, then it sounds like new goals need to be developed, and that will be the path to gaining more services. Okay, and you may want to consult Common Core state standards. You'll see a link there. If you click it, you'll be able to go to it. But Common Core state standards tell you sort of where your son or daughter should be at based on their grade level, based on their age, based on the common level that the state requires for all students, right? So what are students my son's age required commonly to know and to be able to perform? If your son or daughter is not performing any of those, something to consider, right? Something to advocate for. So looking at the Common Core standards may be helpful. When we talk about goals, you may have heard this for many years now, but you must have SMART goals. And SMART is an acronym that only works in English, sorry. But SMART is an acronym for specific, S for specific goals, M for measurable goals, A for goals that include action words, and R, realistic and relevant goals, and time limited. If you wish to read more on SMART goals, you can click right here on the link and you'll be able to see that. So what might be an example? Okay, by May 2018, Chris will improve fine motor skills by using inefficient, I just noticed it's 2018. Clearly this was done a little while ago. By May 2018, Chris will improve fine motor skills by using an efficient grasp to hold and manipulate writing utensils and drawing 4 simple shapes: the line, the circle, the square, the triangle, without assistance, with 90% accuracy in 4 to 5 trials. By including what shapes, you are making sure that that goal is specific. Because if I say 4 shapes, does that mean a circle? Does it mean a heart? Does it mean a rectangle, a pentagon, a diamond shape? What kind of shape are we talking about, right? So this says 4 simple shapes, and it identifies exactly what we're looking at, okay? So that makes it specific. The first letter, SMART, it makes it specific. Then by saying with 90% accuracy, it makes it measurable, right? We can measure. Now, to this, I have a comment though, right? Because let's say a different goal. Let's say my son's or my daughter's goal, pardon me as I grab a darker marker. Give me 1 second. So let's say the goal is for my daughter to write her name. Okay. And let's say my daughter is do they call daughters named after their mommies juniors? No, they don't. So let's say my daughter's name is also Sophia. Okay. You can see it there. If this is 100% accurate, okay, what does it mean to write my name with 90% accuracy, or 70%, or 40, or 50, or 20? If at the end of the year, my daughter writes her name, I may have to turn off my virtual background. Give me 1 second. So if this is 100%, okay, but at the end, my daughter, this is the way that she wrote her name, what are we qualifying this? Is this 30%? Is this 70? Is this 40? So I say this to indicate that you may ask your IEP team to write an example of what the goal will look like when it's met, right? So what will a line look like with 90% accuracy? What will a circle look like with 90% accuracy? What will a square look like? What will a triangle look like with 90% accuracy? Okay, so consider that, because again, sometimes we see these percentages and all that, and where is the scale to determine what percentage it is? Okay, because there might be some conflict there then, because a school may be saying, oh yeah, they met their goal, and you might be saying, this does not look like Sophia, right? It's a start, kind of looks like a 5, kind of looks like, right? So you get to determine that. I'll go to the question on the chat in just a little bit. Next, action words, right? So the goal is to hold it, right? And manipulate the writing utensils. Now, realistic and relevant, okay? In this, it's May of 2018, okay? I'm guessing based on the year that this was created, right? That was realistic and relevant for that person, right? So you've got to make sure this is your SMART. Now, time limited, it gives it a time frame, right? It gives it a time frame. So it's realistic for Chris, for that student, to be able to improve their motor skills, and it's time limited because it's saying by May of 2018. Okay, and that would be a SMART goal. Question: shouldn't all goals be set to Common Core standards, regardless of current ability, and services flow into that gap? Sure. Not very commonly do we hear that the goals, the Common Core standards are the goals in the IEP, but our answer to that would be they could. They could. Because especially if you're saying, you know, my son, my daughter is in mainstream, but they're not really working or giving her the support she needs to be able to keep up with everything that all the other students are doing, then a parent may want to say, I want all the Common Core standards to be the goals in the IEP, right? And or, you know, there may be a main goal and then objectives, right? Because your son or daughter may not be performing at a level where this big goal is a realistic, relevant goal, but you can make that a long-term goal and have objectives below where little by little, they're working toward that. And definitely services should flow into that gap. Right now that you said gap, thank you to the person on the chat. It's important because sometimes, and I'll just mention this, some families have told us, you know, when we initiated the meeting, you know, the person, the school started praising my son or daughter, right? And saying, oh my gosh, Johnny does so great. He is the best in our class. He's amazing. And the parent, who's not going to be happy to hear that their son or daughter is doing well, right? What they didn't expect was that conversation was quickly going to turn into the suggestion that Johnny should graduate from special education and he no longer needs services, right? And so one thing that we caution parents is when we hear about progress, it's important to identify, this is where my son is. If this is where he should be, then whenever he makes progress, all I'm hearing is he's made progress, but the focus is the gap between where he should be and where he is currently, right? He was lower, so he's made progress. Fantastic, awesome. But it doesn't mean we don't have a long way to go, right? And so sometimes in these meetings, you may feel that it takes that direction, right? That we start focusing on, well, they're making progress. That means they may not need anything. But they still may not be at the level that they should be at based on Common Core, based on functional developmental milestones, etc. And so, yes, services should be there to fill that gap. Let me skip through these in Spanish. Okay, so goals should be consistent in accuracy. Where there are many issues of concern, so maybe a little bit related to the question on the chat, you may want to group them by areas and sub areas. Okay, for example, communication is a very big issue of concern for many students. Now, communication includes vocabulary, it includes grammar, phonetics, right? So there are subcategories to this larger area of need. So it may be important for you to consider sub areas, right? And this is where you might see that they get the evaluations are reported in sub-test scores for these areas that are kind of sub areas of a larger area. If you're curious about IEP goals and what they should look like, let me try to flash this on the screen as we speak. Please feel free to access this link here. And this link will take you to an IEP goal bank. And what you can do is select the area that your son or daughter, you know, the area that you're focusing on. So for example, speech and language. And then is it articulation that we're talking about? Is it fluency? Okay, morphology, syntax? Is it the voice? So you can click on any of these, right? So let's go for articulation, oral motor skills. And you may consider these as goals and objectives for you to input into your IEP. So this goal may be, Johnny will increase speech intelligibility to 30% by using appropriate, you know, fill in the blank. And then your objectives would be, if we want to reach this goal, he must use appropriate sentence production. He must have appropriate rate and speed in conversation, etc. You get the drift. So this can be a very important tool as you prepare for your IEP, to look at what a good goal can look like. Okay, and again, objectives are mini goals, okay, that are achieved on the way to achieve goals. Okay, so it's important. And for some areas that our sons and daughters struggle in, this may be very relevant. Okay, so these objectives should move your child closer to the goal and increase his or her ability and independence in this specific area. Okay, the reason why these goals, as we're saying, are so important is because they inform the team what services your son or daughter needs. Okay, and it's important to sort of stay flexible on how the goal will be met, and focus on the fact that it's needed and that there will be a service. Okay, now some things to keep in mind is you may not want to ask for a service because of your child's particular diagnosis. Okay, some districts, and we've heard this from some families, some districts may tell you, oh, you want ABA, but you can't have it because your son doesn't have autism. Keep in mind that while some may consider that to be an appropriate rationale, the truth is that once your son or daughter is in special education, independent from their particular diagnosis, the law says that their needs or that services should be based on their unique needs. Therefore, not every student with autism will have the same services. Not every student with Down syndrome will have the same services. It is an IEP, I for individualized, right? So we want to make sure that it is remaining individual. Okay, so it's important to describe your son's needs, not just, well, he has autism, right? How is autism, how does it manifest through him? What are his needs within autism, right? Especially with a diagnosis like autism, where it is considered a spectrum diagnosis, where we can have a student who has autism who is fully verbal and fluent in his vocabulary and language. And on the other side of the spectrum, we may have a student with also autism, but who is nonverbal and may have no language, may use augmentative methods of communication or alternative methods of communication. So it's important to focus on our son or daughter. Okay, and I'll read the question. There's a question here that says, I'm skipping ahead, and we'll see if we can address it right now. But if my kid isn't meeting the goals, is it appropriate for the district to pull from the mainstream to recommend special day? If my kid isn't getting their RSP time but still falling behind, can I ask for more RSP or allow special day? Yeah, we won't get into the specifics right now of your question, but in general, as a general concept, yeah, if your son isn't meeting those goals, we must ask, what is the reason why they're not? Now, some may want to argue, look, they've had 30 minutes of speech and language. We're going to take it away because they're not making any progress. One might ask ourselves, though, if with communication, speech and language therapy, he's not making any progress in communication, might it be that it's because he actually needs more services, maybe in a different area of need? For example, perhaps your son or daughter needs a lot of regulation support, because without regulation, he or she cannot access the part of their brain that will acquire language, right? So are you telling me, you're right, he's not making progress? It doesn't mean he doesn't need the speech and language. It's sounding like he needs more. He needs more support to regulate. He needs perhaps occupational therapy to create a sensory diet that will help him be calm enough during his communication therapy, his speech and language session, to be able to benefit from that therapy, right? So when we see no progress, absolutely, when they're not meeting their goals, they may be too high, right? Or they may be appropriate, but they may just not be getting enough support to meet that goal. Okay, so how do I get that level of info? So one, I mean, feel free to call us. We can talk about your particular case and think through it and say, well, why do you think your son isn't making progress in his communication? Is it they're not working on enough sub areas, right? For communication, you want to break it down and say, is he having trouble in his receptive language or his expressive? Right? Receptive is I'm understanding the information given to me, versus expressive, I am saying the thoughts that are in my mind. So if we just count communication as both of those and we don't know how they're performing in each of these, we may be struggling. They may not be making progress expressively because they're not even receptively, they're not understanding what language is being given to them. Right. So it takes looking into it. It takes you observing, learning more, learning your child more, if I may, right. Really getting into some specifics of what they might need. Okay. So a few services, and again, services include the following, are not limited to these. It also doesn't mean that everyone will require all of these, but there is audiology services, behavior, counseling. There can be an inclusion specialist, occupational therapy, orientation, parent counseling and training that is available through the school. They may be available through the school. Doesn't mean everyone gets all of these. Now, again, just a quick review. If any of these services are something that you think your son or daughter needs and it is denied, this is when you would go to a due process. If within an IEP meeting you say he's really needing transportation and the school says no, right, then it may mean you may need to go to a due process for that disagreement. Okay, so again, this list is kind of just to give you an idea of what's out there and work backward. Remember, you're not going to go in there and say, I need an inclusion specialist. We're going to work downward, right? If I want an inclusion specialist, let me rephrase that. Not that you want. If your son needs an inclusion specialist, if that is the appropriate service for him, let's work backward and say, now what goal needs to be in the IEP to get the inclusion specialist? And if I want to write the appropriate goal, let me start from the bottom and say, what are the needs? Okay, what's the need? So let's establish the need, let's write the goal, and then let's ask for these services. Okay. Now, as we mentioned, within the IEP meeting, on the IEP document, we're going to talk about accommodations and modifications. Okay. On your Google Drive, you have a list of both of those, different accommodations, different modifications. Know that there's a difference, right, between accommodations and modifications. Accommodations are changes in how the student is learning. Modifications are changing what the student is learning. So for example, an accommodation is, my son is going to read the same book that the rest of his class is reading. It's not changing what he's learning. An accommodation is, my son will get a book that has a larger print and it actually includes pictures in the book, right? But he's learning the same thing, but there are tools to help him learn that same thing that other students are learning. Okay, now the what, so excuse me for skipping too far ahead. So accommodations may be things like scheduling breaks, time extensions. He's going to take the same test. She's going to take the same exact test, but she's going to get extra time. Or she's going to be able to sit in a different room where there's no noise or where the lights are different, because when she looks downward and certain lights really buzz and they make her lose her concentration, whatever that may look like for your daughter, right? For your son or daughter. So does the setting need to change? Equipments or material? Some, I won't go too into depth, but just in case this is relevant. If you are teaching my daughter how to spell, the goal is, does she know how to spell dog? Does it matter whether I sit with my torso up and grip my pen and write C-A, while I'm actually writing it on my notebook, as if you can see it, I don't know, but that's what I'm doing. So does it matter if you're testing my daughter's ability to spell cat, C-A-T? Does it matter if she does it sitting with a pen or having letters and having Velcro on the board and her choosing the appropriate letters, right? If you're testing her ability to spell, let's not mix it up with her ability to hold the pen, right? Her ability to hold the pen may make her score less on being able to spell cat when the issue isn't her spelling ability, it's her motor ability, her fine motor skill, right? So accommodations help that not happen, right? Let's keep in mind, what's the goal of this activity? If this is the goal, my daughter can do that, but using other tools, okay? Does she just need a wider pencil or chalk? Can she do it outside and do it with chalk? Because that's how she learns best, whatever it may be. So examples of accommodation. Modifications, conversely, right, change what the student is expected to learn, okay? So he may be in a classroom and his peers are taking a test based on one book on their grade level, but your son or daughter has a modification to their curriculum, by the way, that maybe no longer meets Common Core standards, right? That is a modification. I won't get into this too much, but I will say, keep in mind that if, let's say, your son or daughter is already in high school, the more modification, or let me backtrack, if your son is in high school and you are choosing between getting a certificate of completion and not, or versus a diploma, which is what other students, typically developing students, get after they graduate high school. Note that the more modifications you have, the further away the student may be walking away from being able to attain a diploma, okay? Because a diploma requires that they learn everything and they perform everything that all the other students did. The more modifications, the more you change what the student is learning, the further away he may be getting from the possibility of achieving a diploma. That being said, that may be okay for the student and for the family. And they may say, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with them getting a certificate. Let's do more modifications because this Common Core curriculum isn't going to work for him or isn't going to work for her. Okay. Going to skip through some of this. And again, you can explore more accommodations and modifications. So placement, okay? Placement is usually, you can read a little bit of the statute there, but placement is usually based on the goals, accommodations, and services, okay? The setting should match what his accommodations, modifications, what services he's receiving, etc. That being said, according to the law, students have the right to be, in terms of placement, they have the right to be in the least restrictive environment. What is the least restrictive environment? To be in a classroom with typically developing peers. That's the least restrictive. Least restrictive is to be like any other typically developing student in the school, okay? So if they need a more restrictive, but it is appropriate for them, then so be it. But the law requires that that student be always in the least restrictive environment, okay? Does that mean then that you may want to ask, well, what supports would my son need in the classroom to remain mainstream? You may ask that. And that is under the concept of least restrictive environment, right? Why limit his ability to interact with typically developing peers, be in the same classroom as them, when all he needs is support in the classroom and he can do it? Why put him in a more restrictive environment if indeed the mainstream environment would be appropriate for him? Okay. All right, so these are some things to keep in mind as we close out this presentation. We have successfully finished part 1 and part 2 of the IEP strategies, and next week, next Thursday, we will be going more specifically into understanding evaluations and requirements for evaluations, etc. And then I'll try to leave more time so we can do questions, okay? But a quick review: introduce all needed information into the different parts of the IEP, meaning let's not wait, right? Let's not wait for the part of the services to speak. Let's start from the bottom. Let's contribute to conversations about the evaluation. Let's contribute to the needs, okay? Always put requests in writing, okay? And always include that magic phrase and have proof that they receive it. They received it. Clearly voice your disagreements at the IEP meeting. Remember the concept between adequate or appropriate versus best and optimal. Remember that you do not have to sign your IEP immediately after the meeting. You can take it home, review it, and sign it within a reasonable amount of time. This gives you time to make sure that you are signing that you understand what you're signing. Okay. Remember that as you sign, it doesn't mean you have to sign an agreement. You can sign in consent, in partial agreement, no agreement. A little point here, actually, that I didn't mention before. There's a difference between consent and agreement. If, let's say, the school is saying, we're going to give your son 10 minutes of speech and language, and you say, okay, I'm going to give my consent, I'm going to let it happen. However, I don't agree that that is the appropriate amount. You may want to note that on the IEP. I am signing to give consent while disagreeing that this is the appropriate amount of minutes that my son needs according to his needs, or however you want to phrase that. The reason why that might be important to do is so that if you do a due process in the future, and remember that you can go to a due process for disagreements in the past 2 years. So let's say year 1, I sign and I say, you know, I don't want to go to a due process right now, but I'm going to give consent to the 10 minutes, but I'm going to already put, I don't agree that that's enough. Then year 2, when I say, you know what, they keep denying more communication, I'm going to go to a due process, pardon me. Then you can demonstrate, look, for 2 years or for 4 IEP meetings, I've been disagreeing with the amount of services that he or she is getting. I've consented because I didn't want my son to lose out, but I'm not in agreement. Okay, so that might be important there. And as you approach the school, know that a collaborative approach is often the best way to go. If you know a lot of information, if you have a lot of information, instead of kind of spewing it, instead of saying it, right? Well, my son has the right to, try to remain collaborative and try to phrase your statement rather as a question. Okay, and that takes some skill. And the reason, 1, questions are more collaborative. 2, you get to hear what the school is saying. And remember, you're recording, right? So if there's anything inappropriate about what the school might be telling you, then you have that now recorded and you can use that in the future. So I say this last point also while disclosing, I may have mentioned it in the previous meeting or previous session last week, but I like to share, I myself am not a parent. And I like to share that because by no means am I saying, just relax, don't let it get to you, just calm down. I know that I don't know what it feels like to be representing your son and daughter in that meeting. And really, get worked up about the things happening in that meeting. That being said, though, I have had the privilege and have the privilege of collaborating with different parents. And what I can tell you that I notice from families is when they can be more collaborative, when they can be as harmonious with the school as possible, it tends to be the more effective way. Does it feel good to kind of say, you know what, you are out of your mind, that probably feels the best. But in terms of results, the most effective is to remain collaborative, right? To really try to express what you need, express questions, get your questions answered, and use your legal rights when you're in disagreement or when they are indeed a violation. Okay, so thank you for being in today's training. We will continue this next week. Again, we will do our presentation on evaluations. If you would like to review that presentation before you even come, you already have it on your Google Drive. And now I will defer the time to the team. And I know that we have a brief poll. And I would greatly appreciate if you're able to fill out that poll. That helps us continue providing these trainings and knowing if it's beneficial and for us to be able to continue doing it. Okay, and I do see a hand up, but I will defer to Cindy or whoever else, and you guys could guide me through the questions.
Anna, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, good night. I have a question. Well, I don't have a very good relationship with the school, and I just feel that right now they just want to get rid of my kid, and I see a lot of things that are happening that are very inconsistent. They're telling me he's, there's no sign of autism. There's, he's doing everything perfectly. He goes everything, but I don't see that. And, they're showing me data, they're showing me some work, and then for other things, they're not wanting to show me. And my son is coming home telling me, I'm not doing that, or they're giving me answers, a lot of things. And I don't know what to do because it's very hard. It's all, now it's at a situation where, it's he said, and then they're telling me, no, that's not happening. And then my son is coming home very frustrated. And they just keep ignoring my concerns. And I feel that I don't know what to do. How can I prove to the team, no, you're telling me that he's capable of doing this. However, look at him. It came to the point that I'm recording him.
Yeah. So, Anna, just to put it out there before hand, know that we can continue this conversation offline. You can give us a call whenever. In general, when parents kind of reach, this level, in the IEP, you can ask the question and make sure that it gets into the IEP of how are they going to be measuring his progress throughout the year. Will you be getting service logs? Will you be getting sample work? Will you be getting, right? So that it can be on the IEP, how this is being measured. So it sounds like perhaps the team may need to look at the goals and see if they are smart. Are they specific enough? Because again, just like I mentioned about if my daughter, my supposed daughter, in the example, her name's Sophia, right? They're telling you, yeah, Miss Anna, he's doing great. And you're saying, this is the way his name's supposed to look. This is the way it's looking, right? So having more tangible examples of what is an achieved goal supposed to look like, and how are we tracking to see if it actually looks that way. You can ask those questions in the IEP, and you can ask that there be, that you are told and that they share with you what is actually being used to track his progress. Because if not, you're kind of in the dark, right? You only have their word to go by it. So maybe you want to request service logs to actually see that he's going to certain therapies. I forgot to mention that earlier. And or create more of these objectives and more of these examples of what will it look like when my son has achieved this goal, to be able to compare it at the end of the year. Okay, I hope that helps a little bit, but again, feel free to contact us offline.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any more questions for Sophia? Okay, so I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. I just have a few more announcements. So I will be putting in the chat the link for the first session that was recorded last Thursday. And this session will also be posted tomorrow. And one more announcement, the CAC, which is the Community Advisory Committee for Long Beach Unified School District, is having a recommendations workshop next month, Wednesday, March 8th, from 6 to 8 at the Teachers Resource Center. If you want more information, you can go ahead and email me, and I will give you more information. But some of the questions that they will be asking for you to fill out are: what is the area of need? What is the problem? What is your recommendation to address the need? How will success be measured? What will success look like? And these are recommendations that are presented to the Board of Education and the district during the monthly meetings that they have. Again, if you would like to participate in this workshop and need more information, feel free to contact me. And thank you everybody for coming, and see you next Thursday for the last part of the IEP sessions.